Welcome to Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are traveling with you through the stories and the worlds that make up an omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And your watchers on this journey are me, Guido.
And me, Rob. And wow, this is an episode we have been waiting for.
Wow, indeed. Yes, it is. And here is what you need to know. This episode is about a personal hero and someone who is an inspiration to this very show and has influenced pretty much everything. I say safely 90% of what we see in comics and comic book movies, especially today. We also have two versions of this very special episode. Our conversation was so great. It went long, happily, and we needed to keep the main episode edited down. So all of our listeners can enjoy our bio of comics legend Mark Gruenwald, who we're talking about today, and then an edited version of our conversation with Catherine Schuller Gruenwald, his widow and legacy advocate.
But if you are a patron of ours on Ko-fi, visit dearwatchers.com and click join, and starting at just $3 per month, you will get more background, including an overview of Mark's work and the unedited, expanded version of our conversation with Kat, featuring more stories and background that we could fit into a normal episode.
It is well worth it for that expanded episode, and we're happy to share it with our supporters.
And with that, dear watchers, welcome to episode 72, and let's check out what's happening in the Omniverse with today's conversation. Mark Gruenwald was the Bronze Age Marvel Bullpen and all of the myths that came with it.
Mark Gruenwald was and is the reason we have the continuity, the handbooks, and the canon in our comics that we do.
Mark Gruenwald is the reason the MCU can even exist.
Mark Gruenwald is one of the reasons this podcast exists.
And Guido, I know you have an extensive bio for Mark that you're going to share, but let's talk a little bit about our personal histories with Mark. And it was so interesting when we started to explore his work more, because I was consuming Mark's work from a really early age without having any idea who he was. I think, unlike you, I was not really looking at the mastheads of the books I was buying as a kid. But the one book I collected, and I was such a nerd, I really loved data and all that kind of stuff from an early age, and I was buying all of the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. It was really the first, and along with the DC Who's Who, the only comics I really sought out and collected as a kid to have every single one. And that was really the brainchild of Mark, compiling all this information in a pre-internet age so that you had it all together. And I just scoured over those.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the other thing I realized I had, which we're kind of going to talk a little bit about it, and also it's how it has evolved, is I had his collected edition of his Squadron Supreme 12-issue miniseries, and I had the edition that had Mark's ashes in it, which is a story I think we're going to go much more in depth in our interview with Kat. But and the sad thing is, I don't know if I still have it. I think when
You don't, and I'm really angry, and we need to confront your mother about this.
I know.
Yes.
I think when she sold my childhood home, I think because it wasn't a comic that went in my long boxes, and I have all of those, I think unfortunately it was with books that kind of just went out somewhere. So hopefully someone out there is still enjoying my Ashes comic of Squadron Supreme. And Guido, what's your background with Mark? Because as you said, he's such an inspiration for this podcast.
Well, since I was older than you and reading comics for longer than you, I was paying attention to writers for a long time. So I always knew who he was. Of course, he has Mark's Remarks, his column in the back of issues. He played a large role in a lot of the titles I was reading, or at least were tangential. And he was the editor-in-chief of Marvel at the peak time that I was reading, early teenage years. And so I always knew who he was and knew that he was this lively, interesting character. But it was really only, I don't even know, the last few years, just as I've dived further into people who ushered in eras of comics and history of comics and the business side of comics, that his name became more important to me, more salient to me. And then I discovered that he had written this magazine, Omniverse, that we're going to talk about a little bit. And it does everything I want. The same thing that the official handbook did for you, Omniverse does for me. He's doing this incredibly academic analysis of world building and worlds and how they all can exist. And it was extraordinary. And so that just set me on the path down a rabbit hole. I've been slowly over the years collecting all of his titles, which we'll talk more about in one of our segments today. And his writing is amazing. His editing was amazing. Everything about him that we've gotten to know is amazing. So he is a legend, and probably should be considered on the Mount Rushmore of Marvel. He absolutely needs to be there.
Yeah, and one thing I took from this conversation with Kat is that she said Mark didn't have a career, he didn't have a job, he had a calling. And I think that really speaks to his journey of being a fan first and then becoming involved in the industry. And I think he really represents the first generation that really went from loving comics into making them. And not that I think Stan and Jack didn't love comics, but they didn't grow up reading them and be obsessed with them in the same way Mark did. They didn't really even exist when they were kids, right? So I think it really reminds me of that cultural shift we also saw in movies like a decade earlier, where people like Martin Scorsese were true obsessives of that medium, and then they had to make movies, as opposed to the previous generation like a Howard Hawks or a John Ford, who were approaching it more like a day job. And today, fandom, sometimes better, sometimes for the worst, is such a big part of the comics world and can lead to podcasts like this one. And of course, I'm sure there aren't many creators working today who didn't start as huge fans first and still consider themselves big fans of the medium.
Yeah, and we know from his bio, and we know from talking to Kat about the way that his being raised by a comic fan made a huge difference. And we hear that story time and again from creators today who grew up, or people we've had on this show and interviewed and worked with, who were influenced by comics being a part of their upbringing. And so I think that's really powerful. And you're right, it is the early days of fandom. He's getting his start in the mid-70s. You already have some of that. Roy Thomas was a fan who became an editor, so he sort of paved the way, but he's a very early example. And then you end up with, this era and people like Mark. So I'm excited to dig in.
Yeah, so now that we've shared our backgrounds with Mark, let's tell our listeners a bit more about his backstory before we get into our interview with Kat.
So Mark Eugene Gruenwald was a comic book writer, editor, a manager, a teacher, an academic, a researcher, sometime penciler, sometime colorist, comedian, creator, an all-around legendary human being who gave us and the world lots of stories and lots of art until his tragic death in 1996. Really long story short, and there are some great resources out there on Mark, including 2 different tribute issues, a back issue from tomorrow's publication, one that Peter Sanderson writes a piece, and one that's really amazing that his widow, Kat, worked on, wrote for, and curated a bunch of people from Marvel Legends past who knew him and wrote essays about him. There's also a forthcoming book that we mentioned briefly in our conversation with Kat from University of Mississippi Press, who are doing some great comic works, and someone's been working on that for a long time. But if you're new to Mark's life, Mark was a lifelong comics fan and started in part because of work he did with his father on something called a primer on reality and comic books and a treatise on reality and comic books. So 2 zine self-published essays in the 70s that led to Omniverse, the Journal of Fictional Reality, a fanzine that lasted just 2 issues, but is an attempt to literally map all fictional reality and figure out what universe stories exist in, ranging from Marvel to DC to Sherlock Holmes to Uncle Scrooge to all micro worlds to an inventory of new comics and how each one was dealing with world building. I mean, we have talked about Omniverse briefly. It's a nerdy obsession of mine. It's part of the inspiration for what we do here, and absolutely the inspiration for our spin-off show, which is called Omniversity. Mark coined the term omniverse. It is believed, and I believe that to be true. First publication of it, at the very least, if he didn't coin it. And he spent a lot of time in that zine and then later in his columns as editor at Marvel, defining what an omniverse was, what a multiverse was, what the different layers of the metaverse were, like how these universes worked and were built. He wrote 2 fan letters before he got started, in a 1969 X-Men and a 1975 Captain America. What's cool is that those weren't available digitally, but luckily I had both of those issues. So we just pulled them out, and it's fun because in the X-Men one, his concerns were about the visual design. He has a lot to say about the X-Men's costumes and the logo, but also the science, and he's sort of challenging the science and wants a clear explanation. While the second to Captain America's team focuses on Watergate and the political reality at the time and the way that Marvel's reality mirrors but diverges and uses our reality. So you can see the things that he was really obsessed with, which continue through his work. And so anyway, he sends Omniverse to Jim Shooter to apply for a job and becomes an associate editor. And the rest is history, but let's try to continue a really quick recap of that extraordinary history now.
Yeah, Mark becomes an editor of Avengers, Hulk, Captain America, Thor, Spider-Woman, What If, many of which of those issues we've actually covered here on Dear Watchers. He also co-creates the official handbook of the Marvel Universe. He did some fill-in penciling in his career too. And then there is also his writing, and we go deep into his work and our thoughts about it in our expanded bonus edition just for our patrons. But Mark co-wrote Contest of Champions, the first Marvel limited series ever in 1982. He wrote Captain America for 10 years, the longest run on the title, and most issues written of it ever, and really among the longest runs in comics history, creating stories and characters that everybody knows. He wrote Quasar, another massive run with a unique and iconic humorous take on the cosmic character, including issues featuring an unsanctioned DC crossover that we've actually covered here on this show. And, of course, he wrote with, Squadron Supreme, which is perhaps the most Watchmen-esque pre-Watchmen title that in some ways delivers on the promise of a dark, reality-based, adult superhero comics even better and with more optimism. He writes DP7 for the New Universe, becomes executive editor, continues his monthly Mark's Remarks, becomes the inspiration for Mobius of the Time Variance Authority, trains new editors, inspired countless Marvel Bullpen antics, which we got to hear a little bit about. He becomes the editor-in-chief, and, of course, unfortunately, tragically passes away very young. Famously, his ashes were included in the ink for a Marvel Universe poster, and then the first trade paperback printings of Squadron Supreme, which my copy is sadly lost to the sands of time. And he did so much more, which we're also going to touch on in today's conversation.
And again, we go into his work in more depth, why it matters so much, the influence of each of his major seminal works, and what we think of them in our expanded bonus version. This bonus version also features the full conversation with our guest, Cat Schuller Gruenwald, unedited. So make sure to become a coffee patron of ours, dearwatchers.com. Click join so you can hear all about Mark, the incredible stories Cat had to share with us, some of which are only available in that expanded version. And if you're listening to the abridged version on our main feeds, here we go. But please do consider joining us for the expanded edition. We're really proud of the background work and the conversation that we had. All right, so we are here with Catherine Schuller Gruenwald. Cat, hi.
Hi, everybody.
So, Kat is a fashion designer, an artist, a teacher, a producer. There's a lot I'm missing, but has done incredible work to create more diversity and inclusion on the runway and in fashion, and has also been doing and been featured on so many panels about comics because of your late husband, Marvel editor and creator Mark Gruenwald, as well as the work you're doing to steward his legacy and to really bring comics to the runway and fuse all of the things you're doing together. Really a highlight of our New York Comic Con was spending a lot of time with you. And we have been looking forward to this conversation for some time. We hope it's the first of an ongoing conversation because you might not know this, Kat, but Mark is a huge influence on this show. He coined the term omniverse, which we use in our tagline. And so his continuity policing, as he called it, his love of deep and complex and very human stories, and your love of the same that we've learned from talking to you. So thank you for being here and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'm always so touched when people appreciate his contribution to the comic book industry, because he really strove for that. You know, I think he was a 360 kind of creator. He was a fan turned pro himself, and he appreciated the fans more than, you know, even the creators that he was working with at Marvel. The fans came first, and he answered all of his fan mail. And because he did that when he was a little boy. He wrote into the letter to column, and he saw his letter to Stan in print, and he said, I knew I was gonna be a writer from that moment on. And so he always made a point of answering the fans, and you know that became like his, you know, he identified with the fans. He was a fan, and he wrote from a fan's perspective, and he said they deserve the very best of that product that we can turn out. And so he was, you know, a really bright light in. He was the heart and soul of Marvel Comics. They've cited that time. And I was just unfortunately fortunate that I had him for such a short period of time in my life. But when you're married to a comic book guy, till death do you part, not
It feels like he was ahead of his time in that way, in that now there's so many fans that are, you're a fan first and then you're getting into actually creating the art yourself. But it almost seems like when you talk to a lot of people from Mark's era, or that came right before Mark's era, that wasn't as much the case. Like, people weren't always like fans of the work. So in that way, him being like this super fan that then became a creator definitely seems like it's the trend that's happening today.
Well, that's a great point. I never even thought of that, because so many people said, you know, oh, I was flipping burgers, or I was working some menial job, and I applied for this job, and Mark took me and he trained me, and he, you know, he had an editor's class every Monday that he, you know, really diligently followed through. And a lot of people attribute their careers to him really taking interest in you know, in training him. And that's that's a really great point, because not that they weren't reading comic books or whatever, but in terms of creating them and how to create and how to create a great comic, and what it took to be in the bullpen, and what it took to write the Marvel way. He was very, you know, he trained so many people. That's what really upset him when Marvel was going through all that bankruptcy, and he had to fire those 25, 35 people that he trained since they were, you know, like, didn't know how to do anything but comics at that point. You know, like that probably ripped him apart more than anything I ever saw, because and it was Christmas week when they made him do it too. Right?
And was that way that he cared so much about people? I mean, it's evident to me in his stories. So, like, did it show up everywhere in his life, and where do you think it came from, this real humanity that he brought into everything he did and the stories you're telling now about him?
Wow, you really know him. These are the most insightful questions I've ever had. Because I understand, I really thought about it, and when I met him, I made up my mind to really contribute to his life and to be a part of his journey, because it really was a journey. He didn't have a career, he didn't have a job, he had a calling, and it was evident, and he was the type of person who was, like I said, that 360 thing. So if you were in his life, you were part of his whole comics were everything to him. So you were part of whatever aspect of it. I was not a fan, but yet I was a comedy writer. So he would have me write the sketches with him for the Comic Cons when he used to play games with fans. So we would come up with these ridiculous things to do with comics that were funny. And I'm thinking, "Oh, I have no business doing this," but I I had a comedy group and he had a comedy group, so he figured out where your skills were, and he knew how to plug and play and put you in, and that you really shone. And then he would just know how to include you and make you feel like you belonged, correct you, criticize you, critique you, whatever. But for the most part, you rose to the occasion. I was doing stuff I never thought I could do just because he asked me. The Comic Con segments, because it was not that hard. You just figured it out. We had a Halloween party, and I had to build this pit and the pendulum thing over our bed, and it's like I'm splattering the walls with this fake blood and making a big giant devil's mask out of red peppers. I'm not, putting rats in the ratatouille, and all this stuff that we came up with, and it was just it. He just made an element of fun that evolved, and he allowed you to contribute where you could and what you could, and then commend you, and then talk about it later, download, upload, whatever, and always talking about how great your contribution was. And it didn't matter if it was Sarah, she was 5 years old. Didn't matter. He knew how to make everybody want to participate and get a charge out of it, because he was a ringleader. I had Rick Parker draw this picture of Mark with a megaphone, a bullhorn in one hand, and pages in the other, dressed like a ringleader, with all the characters in the Marvel universe around him, and standing with a little sign that said "continuity or bust." But
Well,
ringleader,
that's what's so interesting is that hearing you and getting to hear some of the stories about Mark also at New York Comic Con. It was such a combination of the academic side and the fun side, because sometimes you hear the academic, that's very staid. It's not, there's no fun in it. But Mark was writing these very academic essays. He was the guiding force between the official Marvel Handbook, which has this academic, but then he was super fun and he was super encouraging. And as you were saying, he's the ringleader. And at the New York Comic Con panel that you participated in, we saw some photos of these wacky times that were happening at the Marvel offices. So it was such an interesting dichotomy that he was bringing both of these things to his work and his life.
He was the most silly, serious person I ever. He was serious about fun and serious about his work, and about he wanted to elevate the comic book world. And I was talking to Jim Salicrup the other day, and he had worked for Stan Lee, and Stan's real thrust and obvious intention and goal was to elevate the form of comics to a higher level, and to introduce mythology and introduce all these concepts. And it was fun, but there was a headier kind of approach to it. And that's what I think we're talking about here is that it was, but it always was done with this very tongue-in-cheek, lighthearted kind of approach. And he just knew how to find that balance, so it was very Monty Python, meets Joseph Campbell.
Yes, exactly.
Wow, what a pairing that is.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell is John Cleese.
Continuity was so huge from that work that he did with his father, where they're trying to map out how all of fictional reality is connected through to the official handbook and then his work as an editor. Like, why do you think that aspect of storytelling was so important to him?
It just because inconsistencies are the devil's work. I mean, you can't have 10 destroyers, out there, and you can't have, inconsistencies in what superpowers are and where, there has to be a logic. And he treated the fictional reality, like it was reality. And so I think he wanted to embrace the fact that the comic world was just as important with its rules and regulations as the real world. And it just drove him nuts that people did not do their homework. And I mean, he was the trivial king. I mean, I think they had some contest where Stump the Gru or something like that, and nobody could stump him. He obscure fact he knew, and it was up there, and it was in his brain. And he had such a love of comics that he just devoured it. He didn't. I just saw this obsession. It wasn't obsession, it was compulsion. That's what he called it. He said, I don't write because I want to, I'm compelled. So he wrote, and his writing was a compulsion. Mark allowed the antics in the office, and they, to just kind of evolve. And I always went over there. I was like so jealous and enamored and engrossed in all the door art that they had, because they were always razzing each other and teasing each other, and nobody was sacrosanct. And they had door art, that was headlines, and they were all artists, so they were doing some incredible stuff. And at his tribute, I put all that door art up around the hall, and people were looking at it. And I took, my friend was a editor for Sally Jesse Raphael, and said, is there anything I can do? And I said, well, I have all these videotapes that I took from the 5 years that I was taking the Comic-Con footage, and I want to do a bounce down of all the fun that he had with the fans. And so I went through all those tapes and did the code, and then I went in and we just edited, the whole Comic Con, that and I broke it into categories, and what each one, what each game was. And it was probably about 8 minutes or something like that. And then I did his life in pictures, and it was, it was to the Charlie Brown theme, the piano theme. It was just so, the tribute was really, very heartfelt. And then I did another tribute 20 years later. And that's when I introduced the Ashograph, because when I first, met Mark, we started dating, and then we got engaged, and then he wanted a will, because both of his parents were sickly, and he knew to hope for the best but expect the worst. So he wasn't going to marry me unless we did a will. So I said, okay. So he sat there and we read their wills, and one of the contentions in the will was, I want to be cremated and my ashes put into a comic book. And I was like, whatever, okay. And I'll leave it in. I'm sure I'll never have to do it. And, cut to 4 years later, I'm picking the bone chips out of the ash and stirring it into the ink and putting it into Squadron Supreme. I would put it into the Marvel Universe poster first, and then into Squadron Supreme. But we stirred it into the ink, and I said, "This is really the Wacky Widow," you know. And the week that the book came out was August of 97. So he died in August of 96. And then it took about a year. And then the Alex Ross cover had to get done. And then it came out and it was August of 97. And my sister and I decided to take a vacation in August because when she came back, I mean, after he passed away, I had to stand up in front of 750 blubbering DC and Marvel, employees and try to keep my composure. So my sister is a holistic healer, and so she did some energy balancing on me, and I was able to speak somewhat intelligently without breaking down. And because I don't know about you, but you see a room full of people crying and it makes you cry. It's almost like when somebody's, throwing up, it makes you retch too. And everybody crying. Oh God. So I just kept it together. And then 10 days later, she went back and she calls me up and she said, "You're never going to believe this, but Dave passed away while I was in New York." So her husband had died while she was helping me, do Mark. And it was like a Chekhov play, guys. I mean, it's like the two sisters are joined by the death of their husband the same month. So we decided to go away and channel our husbands and find out why they died so young. And so we went to Hawaii, and I said, "Oh, I think that the book is dropping this week." So we went over to this comic book store, and come to find out that my visit there was quite noteworthy because they knew who I was. And I found out in Baltimore that this woman who was Hawaiian she went into the store and they said, "You'll never believe who was here." And so I started to read the preface that I wrote, and then I turned on the television, and Princess Di had passed away suddenly that day, and it was like, oh my gosh, talk about being on vacation and being out of the loop. And I guess it was because of that, and then Marvel had a pretty good PR person, and so I got to do every BBC, every news program, articles, interviews, morning shows about the ashes in the comic. And what would you do? Where would you put your ashes? And so I tried to be the kind of the lighthearted widow. So I said he threw himself into his work. That became the kind of the tagline that I was known for. So he threw himself into his work. So cut to 26 years later, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame in July at San Diego Con. They have the Will Eisner Awards out there in San Diego. And so finally, they inducted him, and at the same week, Contest of the Champions dropped, and that was the crossover. The book that Mark had created, the crossover challenge. So the superhero versus never really existed until he created it with Contest of the Champions. So it was kind of ironic that they dropped that book. So I was trying to think of how I could honor him, because it's illegal to put ashes into the con. Well, it's not condoned. Put it that way. I don't know if it's illegal. I think it's illegal to put Native American anything, but they weren't, and it's over in China. I mean, the plant is not up in Connecticut, where I drove up there and just found the pressman who wasn't weirded out by having to put these ashes. But I said, "Oh, I think I want to do another thing. Maybe have a special cover on it with ink and ashes or whatever." But I'm creating these comic book bracelets with old comics, and I'm using resin, and I'm reading up on resin, and I see all these. It's almost like a bee in amber. It's like you can float things within the resin, and I said, "Oh." I'm going to do the ashes in the resin. So I made a mold. My producer and I for Cosmoda came up with this idea, and we found this woman on Etsy who made the mold of his autograph, and it's about 1/16 of an inch deep, and we put resin in the autograph, and then I sprinkled the ashes in there, and it hardened, and it really looks amazing. So we pop it out.
It
And we
does.
put it on the cover of this contest of the champions, and it's we calling it the Mark Gruenwald Ashraf series. So it's only 100 books, and we're going to start doing. I have next week, November 12th. I'm at the East Side Mags in Montclair, and then I'm going to do a couple in Staten Island and some comic book stores. I'm going to do one in the Perky Nerd. I'm going to go out to LA in December and do that, and maybe in March I'm going to have something with Roy Thomas at Forbidden Planet. They like the concept, but people were like, "Oh, we don't know about a signing," because I have I have a letter of authenticity that I sign. There's a little QR code that has a video of how the process is done, and so it's all very, kind of nice package. But I'm starting to sell those, and it's really amazing how people are gravitating to that idea. It really struck a chord, and and I have this uh, little cartoon underneath the ashgraph with a pointer. It says, "Yep, he's in there."
Well, what a beautiful intersection it is between who you are and who he is, in terms of you being the designer and working with physical materials in the fashion realm, and then being able to combine that with what his final wishes were and obviously his impact on comics. So it really feels like an extraordinary fusion. So it was great. We got to see one of them when we saw you at New York Comic Con.
They really look good, and
they're incredible.
They're creepy and cool and collectible and controversial.
All the C's. Yeah.
But everything you're talking about, I mean, it's interesting to hear even now you talk about the people who are impacted by him, who are a part of your life now, because I think what that speaks to is really, again, the power of that human thing that people who know his work or the way he worked are going to forever be changed by. And I think that's what it brings people to want to honor that, and want to honor that in the best way, with integrity, with humanity, with support of his legacy. And you're shepherding so much of that. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think that they appreciated the fact that I came into the picture, and the dark places that he was at because, of his divorce. And then he had a girlfriend that died. And then he was just in such a dark, dark space. And, I met him, and he just liked, the fact that we were together so much that it really influenced his work. And I thought that, that's the best that you can do with a relationship. A relationship is recreation, and it really enhances your life, and it should not detract at all. And I was glad I met him. They had I was a plus size model in the 80s and 90s, and they came to the plus size agency and asked, because they didn't have cosplayers in those days. You had to dress up like characters, and they hired models to dress up like Spider-Man and whatever. So they wanted She-Hulk, and they figured, well, we'll just go, see big women. But we weren't big like that. We weren't steroided out. So, I was sitting there, and, I said, well, and we really got along. And I said, wow, I really like this comic book guy, and I said, he said, maybe we can, have coffee or something. I said, well, I really don't, date somebody who I'm working with. And he goes, you don't have the job. He said, but you'd be better for the Enchantress. And I was like, okay. So I looked at the Enchantress, and I was like, oh my God, was that the better compliment than looking like the She-Hulk? Oh my God. So, I had an Enchantress outfit made up for Cosmoda because I do a show now. Imagine if Comic Con had a baby with Fashion Week. That's
Mm-hmm.
what Cosmoda Cosplay Runway is, cosplay, but it's also, fashion, and it is extremely, these people are dedicated. I mean, they are extremely precise about their costumes, and in a way that Mark would love, because he loved how. And he loved comics, and he loved characters, and he would come to my fashion shows, and he would sketch all these new ideas for outfits and for costumes. And and he said there's so much similarity between comics and fashion. And I was like, you're right. So when I met Dan, and he said, let's do a fashion show or something like that. Then we came up with Cosmoda, which was just like a great title. And then Cosplay Runway was available as a domain name, which was kind of like the universe telling me do it. And so we have kind of a mixed bag of what the show actually is. It's true cosplayers, but then I go to my designers and say, do you want to do a fantasy look? Do you want to do something that's out of the box? And so I have designers doing like incredible stuff that it may not be a character so much as it could be. But and then we did Night of a Thousand Ahuras, for Nichelle Nicole. So we have, and then we're promoting this new movie called Cosplay Universe. So this is it's a documentary, and I encourage everyone to look up Cosplay Universe, the movie Cosplay Universe movie. On Instagram, and there's a link, and just download it because it's truly a great movie, and it's very entertaining. They follow 5 top cosplayers. Yaya Han's one of them, and they wind up at the Olympics of Comic Con of Comic Cons in Japan. So it's a really heartfelt, interesting story. You get in depth, about what makes these cosplayers tick, and then how they take it so seriously when they're going to these competitions. And I just thought that it's just such a great cosplay. So it's just so multifaceted. I am going to try and teach cosplay uh, costuming at FIT, because I teach at FIT, and I teach uh, fashion for diversity. I teach plus size and petite, so outliers. But I thought I'm going to do cosplay because when I wanted to get my outfit done, I went to cosplayers and I paid them to do it. So it's going to be I think it's going to be a $28 billion industry or something
Yeah.
like.
Well, you were saying that Mark was seeing the writing on the wall with movies and that he was so ahead of the time, and you've been the same way with how fashion and cosplay has emerged. Because when I first started going to Comic-Con, you saw a few people, but now, as you said, it is this giant industry, and there's whole floors at Comic-Con with people where you can get your photo with famous cosplayers. And that was, I think, definitely something that you were tapped into way ahead of the time, just as Mark was tapped into the evolution of the comics industry.
Yeah, and I think someone said, this woman who runs Fashion Mingle, who's like the LinkedIn for the fashion world, said this is a combination of everything you've done up to this point in your life. So the fashion. I had a magazine. I did events. I met Mark. I had Comic Con background. And then I met the fans, and then the fans suggested that I do something with them, and I'm like, well, I don't know what to do except fashion. I really can't do anything but fashion. So no, we're gonna do that. So we thought, all right, Comic Con's gonna have a baby with Fashion Week, and and that that's what kind of did it. And I want to be a disruptor in my industry too, because I was always in I was rejected because I wasn't a size 4. I was a plus size model when it was very unpopular to be anything but a stick figure. And so I kind of broke through that and showed, that there was a different standard of beauty and a different aspect, and it was just good for business, and I try to tell these manufacturers, there's 67 million women who are not what you're designing those clothes for. you a lot of, and just because you don't think that you want to do your homework about this body type, because it's not just graded up, you have to really go in and do your homework. I can help you with that. So that's been my mission. And Mark always said that, leave the industry better than you found it. So I was one of the first plus size models, and now you see plus size models everywhere, and it's so heartening for that. And I think that was a lesson that I got from him. And the industry doesn't owe you a career. You have to carve out your own niche. Mark did it. He created Omniverse. He created the Journal of Fictional Reality, and he brought his portfolio in, and Shooter was looking for an assistant editor, an assistant, and hired him because of that very thing, that he had obviously gone into a lot of depth. And if you can get your hands on a couple of those omniverses, I have the 3rd copy that's in my warehouse. I think I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3. So
wow. Yeah, I have a few copies of 1 and 2 each, because every time I see them, I need to buy them. And I know the cover for 3 was released, but never saw the light of day. So my gosh, that is something special.
I know. So I have his calendars too, because he wrote in a calendar every single day. So he wrote in from 78 to 96. I have his calendars every single day. So I want to transcribe them, because I feel like it's a chronicle of what happened, not only in his life, but at Marvel. I mean, he has the day that something happened in his calendar, and you may know that date was sometime around 1979, but he's got it in his calendar. So there's a fan who put together all of the remarks about Mark. So Mark's column was Mark's remarks.
Yeah, Mark's remarks.
Yeah, John put together remarks about Mark and gave it to me, and it was so heartwarming. I think that I'm fortunate that I was able to grieve along with everyone else who was totally missed him. And I'm so glad that I got a chance to read that, and all the different books that are coming out now. There's a book that Jason Olson wrote. He's a professor at Utah University, and he wrote a book called Mark Gruenwald and the Star-Spangled Significance, or something like symbolism, of Captain America. And I bought that book. I didn't even realize that it was out, and I read it, and the first opening line was, when Mark Gruenwald died, there was a giant hole left in the industry. And I continued to read it, and I said, why didn't this guy interview anyone? And I understand now, because he knew Mark's work so well, and he was a latchkey kid. And when Mark taught him everything he needed to know about how to approach life. I was like, geez, can you imagine having an influence on a kid like that? And so then he wrote a book, and he was dead on. I mean, his references and the way he inferred things through Mark's work, he understood Mark through his work. He didn't have to interview everybody. He did it work. So it's a really interesting read. So I
think you said you did talk to someone who has a forthcoming piece that is more biographical, right?
Yeah. Paul Allen contacted me about 2 years ago, and so I put him in touch with all kinds of people who never got interviewed. So his best friend he met in the 70s, Dean Mullaney, who I think he works at Eclipse, and he was a dear friend of his, and so I put him in touch with them. And so this book is it's called A Master of Fictional Reality, Mark Gruenwald, Master of Fictional Reality, and I read it and I had to fact check it, and there were some things that were off, and so it is really, and it had to be only a certain amount of pages. And the guy I gave him, this best friend, he had so many different stories, and Paul said, "Well, you should do your own book, because you have stories that I couldn't include because I could only, I don't know how many words a 200-page book is, but I could only have that many words." And he said, "You have so many other things to say." So, oh my gosh, I'm talking about, he was 43 when he passed away. I think he, I don't
Yeah,
could have
lived
been more.
many lifetimes in those 43 years.
I know. I can only imagine lived to be 93. But I found when I was doing the tribute, the 20th year tribute, I looked in this drawer and there was a cassette tape from '87, and I was like, "Now, how the heck did that get in there?" And I luckily had a Walkman. I don't know how the heck I still had a Walkman. And I put it in, and it was queued up to this. He wrote songs too, so he played guitar and he wrote songs, and it was queued up to this song called "The Secret Life of Dying Twice." And I was like, "That's exactly what he did."
Wow.
And
Wow.
and it was so fun to hear his voice and hear him, singing. And I went to sleep, and then I woke up and I wrote the second part of it. It wasn't in the plan. I meant to live as long as Stan. That. And second part of it, and then I sang it at the tribute, but I piped his voice into the hall, and
Oh my gosh.
wow, they could hear him. It was riveting. I don't know why. The reason why I have the ashes I have now is because they, after the first printing of Squadron Supreme that I put him into, they wanted more ash, and I was like, "Okay, I'll see if I can find some." And I went to the warehouse. I couldn't find him, and I was like, "I don't want to go in." And I found him because I went back, and he was right where I thought he would be. So he was hiding on them because I think I fulfilled that wish, and now I wouldn't have to do the astrograph with if I had given them all away to Marvel. And maybe, in his infinite wisdom, which is now infinite, he knew that at some point in time he would plant the astrograph idea in my
Yeah. I believe that. I believe that.
That and make that happen. And I think, he so it's very funny that I just did an interview with somebody about relationships, and I still have a relationship with him that is, it's just different. I mean, I don't see him, and I can't touch him and kiss him and, spend the kind of time we had. But, I am his legacy advocate, and I give myself that title, and I take it very seriously. And I think, we have some more things to happen that I can't wait to see what's going to emerge, and new things will be released. Maybe Serpent Society, maybe Squadron Supreme will be a movie. Who knows?
Yeah.
So
sure.
Yes.
But his DNA, his fingerprint is in everything, and I see that.
It is.
I see that, and having people like you and his fans who inform me about that, no matter what, it fuels me, because he used to say to me, "I can't imagine having an insignificant life," and I was like, "God, that's exactly what he did." He made it so that his life was significant while he was living it, but then, posthumously too. And if he chose me for that purpose, then I guess I was assigned the task, and I'm trying to live up to it. And, meeting people like you is just great, because it's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I do.
You are doing it. Yes.
You are, and you're doing it beautifully. And as we've taken a lot of your time, so as we wrap up, I think this whole conversation has been a clear indicator of Mark's legacy, but I'm curious, like, how you'd summarize what it is about his legacy that you want everyone to hold on to.
That no matter how you approach life should be all inclusive and should really matter. The people in your life that you work with, that and if you're lucky enough to find a profession that used to be a hobby and that you now dedicate yourself to, go whole hog with it, and just include yourself in everything. Meet people, talk it up, and connect, because Mark was a connector, and it's all about that connecting. And he just enjoyed, got a kick out of what people brought to the table and how to pull that out of them and mold that into something that was valuable to him and to them. And I just think, if we can strive to do that, and really, I never hear a bad word about him, and I also never heard him say a bad word about anybody. And I mean, he had people that annoyed him, but he didn't ever use the word hate, so I think that, using that, to kind of approach how you need to leave an indelible mark on how you do that. That's one of the things I've learned so much from him, just how he operated in approaching my work like that, has given me, I run my backstage like a bullpen. I'm taking ideas. I don't care. You got an idea? Tell me the idea. I will incorporate it if I can. Tell me, And so I learned so much about that, and the kindness and tolerance and compassion, but also finding something you're really interested in is truly a gift. I'm so happy that I saw his storyboards when he was 5 years old. So believe me, he became exactly what he needed to be. And we're all the better for it. We are all the better.
Yeah.
And,
yes.
And as Stan would say, Excelsior.
Yeah, this has been amazing. Yeah. And I hope that you'll join us again for more conversations and more stories. And because I think we could take any piece of our conversation and probably spend hours
exactly.
just on that piece of who he was and who you are and the work that you're doing, building on the work that he did. So thank you for your time, and we appreciate it so much.
Thank you for such insightful questions, and for really delving deep into what makes Mark tick. So you questions that a lot of people don't ask, and I really commend you on that. It's very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there we have it. We've come to the end of our rope.
All right. That is a wrap. And wow, that was really special. Dear Watchers, thank you for joining us on this really special episode. I have been Guido.
And I have been Rob. And you can find Kat's work with Cosplay Runway on Instagram and Facebook as @Cosmoda.
That's COSMODA.
Thank you. Or at cosplayrunway.com. And we'll, of course, include those links in the show notes. And you can also often find Kat celebrating Mark's legacy on panels at Comic-Cons throughout the world. So check your local listings because you are not going to want to miss one of those panels. We went to one at New York Comic-Con and it was a blast with tons of legends, including Kat herself.
And if you just finished the Abridged episode, make sure you consider joining us at dearwatchers.com. Click join, become a patron, and you can get the full expanded version. And if you just wrapped up the expanded version, we hope you enjoyed it. Please let us know anywhere on social media that we probably are at Dear Watchers. So again, thank you, Kat. Thank you, listeners, for joining us.
Please leave a review wherever you listen. We'll be back soon with another trip through the multiverse.
In the meantime, in the words of Uatu, keep pondering the possibilities.